Hello and welcome to The Learning Lounge, iHasco's monthly podcast series where we delve into a variety of subjects as we look to uncover opinions, expertise and experiences with our studio guests. Today we'll be speaking to our guests about where the line should be drawn between banter and bullying, and how businesses can maintain a positive company culture in a modern workplace. I'm joined by two fantastic guests to help talk through this incredible topic. First of all, we have Abbey Wright, Junior HR Advisor here at iHasco. Abbey, welcome.
Hi.
And we have Gillian McAteer, Director of Employment Law at Citation. Gillian, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining us. We're going to dive straight into the good stuff here. Please, tell me a little bit about your roles. Tell me what you do and your sort of day-to-day as well. Abbey, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I'm Abbey. I'm a Junior HR Advisor. So I've been in HR now for, I think, 5 years, and then at iHasco for about 2. I deal with anything employee relations, payroll, a lot of ad hoc queries, coaching, helping the management staff, but really any questions that anyone has, I'm happy to answer.
Oh, fantastic. And Gillian?
I started as a solicitor in private practice and spent 10 years in private practice before I moved to Citation 21 years ago, originally as employment law advisor. And then I managed the advice team for 10 years before I moved into my current role where I'm responsible for all employment law advice within the business.
Okay, great. Well, two fantastic guests with us today, and we'll start getting stuck into the fountain of knowledge that I'm sure is there to be unleashed. So can we just start off by explaining, perhaps Abbey, if you can, just from your experience and working in the HR side of things, can you explain how workplace bullying affects sort of overall company culture and the day-to-day interactions between employees?
Yeah, I mean, bullying overall and just kind of that negative behaviour can create a really negative culture, and therefore people just don't interact as well. They don't have those open communications. Obviously, it can cause problems between employees and the management as well. And it can just create quite a tough environment. I mean, we all want to come to work and have a good day, and, we're here most of our time. So just having that positive culture is really important, to be honest.
And do you find that there's some things that you sort of have to keep an eye out for? Because obviously you can imagine some of the bullying side of things. This can be things that happen under the surface. So there's certain things that you sort of keep an eye out for when you're just going about your day to day.
Yeah, I mean, just to be honest, having those open communications, even just if that's kind of walking the floor and asking questions, how is everyone today? You can kind of find out if someone's having a bad day or if something's happened, and then you can kind of help from there, I think.
Yeah, great stuff. And Gillian, what would you say that some of the most common signs are of a toxic work environment that could be caused by bullying?
Well, I think a lot of the basic business metrics will show if you've got a toxic environment, because you'll have higher levels of sickness absence, lower productivity, low morale, you'll have poor retention rates. So they're always an indicator that there may be something wrong with the culture of the business. But in terms of the way in which people operate on a day-to-day basis, you'll find perhaps a bit more defensiveness, people not collaborating as much. A very, very great reluctance to take ownership or accept that someone has made a mistake, real blame culture. So there's usually lots of signs that something is going wrong if you keep your eyes open for it.
And do you think that sort of that the emotional intelligence side of things, it sounds like that would be quite a key thing to have as well, because you can look at metrics, but also, like you were just alluding to, you sort of have to be able to read the room a little bit.
Absolutely. I completely agree with Abbey said about going out and speaking to people. It's so important that there is that level of communication. I think it's so important that managers have time with their people in their team on a one-to-one basis. So it helps really engender that feeling of trust, so that if there is something they're unhappy about, they feel open to talk about it. And I think that a real negative culture can get a grip on organisations. And you can't just expect a positive culture to be created out of nothing. You've got to really work at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Abbey, from your perspective, would you say it's easy to sort of work out whether you might be looking at a bullying kind of culture, or whether it's just purely a negative culture, which could be for other reasons? You know, if you're looking at metrics, or if you're speaking to people and people are down for all kinds of reasons, it doesn't necessarily point to bullying, right? So it's not always super obvious. But is there anything that you sort of try to use or tactics to try and get to the root of the problem or understand it?
Yeah, I think you just have to look at a whole load of things. It could be the benefits that you bring with the company. You know, are you giving them that experience that they want? And I think if overall that's negative and you're not providing them with that care, then that could just be a negative culture. But then obviously you've got the bullying side where people are kind of purposefully hurting each other, and that's when you kind of need to look into that and go down that route. But I think a negative culture overall can just kind of lead to lots of things that Gillian said, like that absenteeism, and then looking into that and kind of seeing why is that, and looking at the root of the problem, I think is really, really important, just to try and resolve that.
That's really interesting. And Gillian, actually, just on that, like, is it a chicken egg situation in terms of bullying can be the root cause of the negative culture, and then also the negative culture itself could be the thing that leads to bullying because of, various targets need to be met and someone's getting very strict and they take it over the line? I mean, is it that kind of thing, or is there one that seems to breed the other?
No, I think they can feed into each other. So if people are unhappy at work, they're more likely to express that in the way in which they deal with others. So and one of the key things in terms of identifying whether there are other reasons why people are feeling or having low morale about work, or whether there's actually bullying, is looking at things as a really robust exit interview process. Unfortunately, it might be too late for that person to turn it around, but it's the lessons you can learn from other people is what led them to want to leave the business.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just pushing on to the legal side of things, can you sort of outline for our viewers and our listeners, what are the potential legal consequences for a company if workplace bullying is not addressed correctly?
Well, this can be extremely serious. If you have someone who feels that, for example, they've been forced to leave the business because of bullying, they can bring a constructive unfair dismissal claim. But actually, if the bullying has been linked to a protected characteristic, these are characteristics under the Equality Act which are protected, things like age or sex or race or religion or belief or disability. If the unwanted conduct is linked to that, they don't need to have any service. They can bring a claim for harassment, and that's actually a type of discrimination. There's also an overriding duty on employers to look after the health and safety of their employees. So if you're found to be in breach of that, there can be claims arising from that. So it is potentially very serious for employers and extremely expensive if they get it wrong, quite apart from, of course, the reputational risks they run.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched upon some of the, I guess, charges or cases could be brought. I mean, what are the kind of penalties that guilty businesses could actually expect to face?
Well, for harassment claims, for example, those it's uncapped in terms of damages, and there have been some very high-profile cases where it's actually cost businesses hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it's not uncommon to have awards of, 50, 60,000 pounds for, just as an almost routine award. So, but as I say, it's potentially uncapped.
Wow. So I'm sure everyone listening is probably thinking about what kind of steps that their business leaders can take to protect their organizations from legal risks. Perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about the kind of steps that they could take.
Well, I think most employers would recognize that it's important to have the right policies in place. And that is obviously a very good starting point. But unless they can show, particularly, for example, in harassment claims, unless they can show that they have taken all reasonable steps to prevent this from happening in the first place, they will be liable for these activities, even if it's completely against their policies. So what they need to be able to show is that in addition to the policies, they have trained everyone on those policies. They've trained their managers on how to handle the situations. That training needs to be robust and it needs to be carried out regularly. And crucially, they need to show that that training is put into practice on a day-to-day basis. Because if you can have all the training and you can have the right policies, but if when things arise in the workplace, they're not being picked up and dealt with appropriately, then unfortunately you will be liable.
Negates everything that's gone before.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about having, like you say, putting those structures in place. It's genuinely seeing them through when the going gets tough or when something is genuinely arises. I mean, Abbey, from your perspective, I mean, you work, in amongst it at a training company, ones that I'm sure put together these kind of courses and the kind of things that our customers will be using to help sort of enact these kind of things. How does it work from your perspective in terms of, do you do the training with your team and everything, and how do they respond to it, and how are you able to sort of enact the kind of policies that Gillian's kind of talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, we have our own system, which has different courses on it. Some of them, for example, bullying and harassment, which kind of just goes through the simples of how to treat everyone with respect, basically. We obviously have other training, and then I think it comes a lot. It's not so much training, but it's more just kind of the culture and how you treat your staff as well. I feel like is almost the training piece in itself, because if the colleagues can see how the management are treating their staff, it's like treat people how you want to be treated kind of thing. If the management staff are treating people and showing that bullying, harassment, we have a zero tolerance policy, the colleagues are then going to follow that. Obviously, we have policies and specific policies that cover those as well. But I think a lot of it is kind of teachable through that face-to-face interaction as well.
It sounds like leadership is such an important part of it, whether that's a leadership of a team or an entire department or even the business itself. Like you say, it sort of trickles down, that kind of the personality of the business is kind of set by those who run it, right? Great. So just looking on to the topic of the podcast today, obviously we looking at drawing the line between banter and bullying, something that I think everyone can resonate with, because we all want to be in a business and a work environment where we feel we can laugh and joke and have that little bit of banter amongst people. I'm sure some people hate banter completely and rather have headphones on all day. Absolutely fine. But there is a boundary to where banter becomes bullying. And I think it'd be interesting just to sort of delve into how we can distinguish that and give our viewers and listeners something to take away so they can spot that as well. Gillian, just starting with you, how would you say that business leaders and managers can distinguish, what is harmless banter on the one side and harmful bullying on the other?
I think it is so tricky because, as you say, banter, this sort of jovial teasing, which is meant to be friendly and amusing, and humour is so important to workplaces. But what is funny to one person will not be funny to someone else. And it is entirely subjective when you approach this. So I think it is very, very difficult to assume that because something was intended, for example, to be funny, then it shouldn't be taken seriously. If it is anything related to a protected characteristic, for example, it really has to be unacceptable. And I think business leaders need to avoid falling into the trap, for example, of a manager, if inappropriate things are being said, but everyone's laughing, assuming that's okay, because case law tells us time and time again that just because someone isn't objecting to something doesn't mean to say they're not offended by it. Or indeed, even if they are genuinely finding it funny, it doesn't mean to say that at some point a line won't be crossed and then it will be seen as unacceptable, and there may be a claim. And we've often seen instances of that where claimants have admitted, yes, well, I laughed along this, but that was a step too far. So when is actually the step too far? So I would say, really, it's about not falling into that some complacency of thinking banter is okay. If it is touching on protected characteristics, if it could potentially be perceived as negative, then I'm afraid I've got to be a bit of a stick in the mud and say people should not be doing it in the first place.
Obviously, if we put the protected characteristic side of things, it seems I think that feels more black and white, honestly. Not to say that someone can make a mistake and these things can crop up, that they would need to be nipped in the bud extremely quickly. But if we just look at those sort of more grey area kind of things, what ways can context and intent play a role in determining whether behavior is considered banter or bullying? I know that you've said about that idea of well, I just meant it to be funny. You know, I guess there's a point where if it's repeated, or if there's a really clear objection, or if there's not a clear objection, but it's maybe breeding a reaction that, you know, could be read as such. I mean, where does that come in? Because, you know, there'll be some people out there who maybe love a good bit of banter and a joke and stuff, who just can be oblivious, you know, don't have that emotional intelligence to recognize when these things are not landing.
Well, I think intent usually is irrelevant. So it doesn't really matter that you intended it to be funny. It's really how it's perceived by the recipient of it. Context can come into it. However, I think the real protection from the business here is training. As you have said, there may be people who genuinely don't understand how it may be perceived, but that's the purpose of your training. And again, going back to what Abbey said about having the right culture in place, it's about people feeling that it's okay to say that, oh, well, you know, I didn't really appreciate that comment. Or if they don't feel comfortable saying that to the person who actually mentioned it, mentioning it to their manager, and this not be seen as, oh, you're being a troublemaker, this being seen as a positive step. So it's about getting that culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Giving them a process to speak up in a way that they don't feel that they're, like you said, they're not doing a sort of a you know, sneaking on them or trying to cause a ruckus, which I think is something that people find off-putting about raising complaints in the first place. We need to get rid of that stigma so that people feel comfortable just to say when something wasn't cool. Yeah. Abbey, just to you, like, especially within your role that you have here at iHasco, what kind of strategies can companies implement to ensure that all employees understand the differences between acceptable banter and bullying, and how to speak up and feel comfortable doing so if they do feel uncomfortable? I mean, obviously Gillian's talked about the types of training we can do, but is there anything specific to your role that you find is really helpful?
I think in my role specifically, I do a lot of coaching. So what that intends is spending a lot of time with management and just saying, this is how I'd handle this situation. As a HR advisor, pretty much most of my role is advising, obviously. So just kind of saying to them, this is how we should approach this situation, even in the one-to-one, starting with that open conversation of, how are you? You know, are you okay? Has anything happened this week that you want to talk to me about? And that kind of opens up the doors for them to then have that conversation with you and say, well, actually, no, something did happen and I just want to talk to you about it. And again, it's that stigma of, let's talk about it. You're not, you know, for lack of a better word, ratting anyone out or, you know, being sneaky or whatever. It's just saying how you feel and talking about it. And then having that open communication with management and staff, I think there will be that more openness with colleagues in saying how they feel and if something has happened. And that way, I mean, you can deal with it in a more informal process, which is a lot easier than a formal process.
That sounds great. I mean, I think the reason that sounds particularly effective is because you're scheduling something weekly. It almost means the content of those meetings is not sort of prioritized for the person speaking. Well, I've got my meeting, so I'll chat about what's happened, and it means there's an opportunity. They haven't had to specifically go and organize a meeting to do it. You've taken the onus and the pressure away from it being about this thing I need to bring up, and all the courage it takes to have to do that in the moment. Whereas they know they're going to be meeting with you. They might maybe have not even thought to have brought it up, but it's something that's been bugging them because you're asking them those questions every week. They're able to think about it. I can just imagine that's something that you find really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, having those regular one-to-ones is so important. It's not like you're just springing it on them. You know, you can't suddenly have a meeting with someone and say, how are you? It's expecting them to be open and telling you how they feel. So having those regular one-to-ones, I think it builds that rapport. And it builds that trust, and then they can talk to you. And then, as I said just before, it's a lot easier to deal with informally, be able to kind of, maybe if it's a situation where you could mediate and just get those two people together or whoever it is and say, can we talk about it? Can we resolve this informally? So much easier than going down the formal route. I mean, if the formal route has to be followed, then of course we'll happily follow it. But it's a lot easier to just have those conversations and just be honest with each other, I think. That's
great. Open lines of communication and dialogue is always the key, isn't it? You know, just keeping on the HR topic for now, can you discuss the role of HR and other leaders in setting the tone for what is considered, say, appropriate behavior on one side and then obviously bullying or something harmful on the other? And how does this influence the perception of banter versus bullying?
I think, to put it really simply, if it's not a two-way thing, then it's not banter, it's bullying. And I think that's a really simple way that people can kind of perceive that, is that if it's not both of you having a joke and having an acceptable joke, then it's bullying, and it's not, and it shouldn't be done, and it shouldn't be acceptable. I think ways that we can put it in place, again, is just by being that example and saying that this is not okay. Speak up. If you know there's a colleague who maybe feels a bit shy or doesn't feel like saying that's inappropriate, maybe just say, that's inappropriate, we shouldn't be talking about that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that. You could obviously pull them to the side and just say, hi, we shouldn't be talking about these kind of things at work, and that's completely fine as well. And I think, just again, I feel like repeating myself with the open communication, but it is so important. And I think it stems a lot of these conversations and kind of nits it in the bud there and then. And that defines the line between banter and bullying, really.
Yeah, 100% agree. I know, Gillian, we were talking earlier and you mentioned about the kind of metrics that you might look to see when a toxic culture has kind of arisen. I mean, we can just delve into that kind of idea of measuring and sort of trying to measure the health of your company culture. How can HR departments measure the health of their company culture and continuously identify areas for improvement? I imagine, it'll hark back to those kind of things that you would look for the red flags as well.
Yes, but I'm a big fan of engagement surveys. I think asking people how they feel about work in an anonymous, confidential way is really powerful. And that can be done in lots of different ways. You can get really complex surveys, which will give you a report that's that thick, which sometimes business leaders will not read, and so it's a rather futile exercise. Or it can be just simply a temperature check, asking people a dozen questions and doing that on a fairly regular basis. And what would be regular enough for the business would very much depend on what suits them. But that can be so powerful. And I remember a case where I had where the business suspected they had two sites in a city. They suspected they had an engagement problem. They did a survey, and it was so telling, the difference between two sites. One had sky high engagement and one had really low levels of engagement. But the key to all of that was disclosed in the question of my manager cares about me. And in one site, people were saying, the vast majority of people saying they really agreed with that. And another site, it was really low. So asking people how they feel, but then, of course, very importantly, following that up, because there is nothing worse than asking people how they feel and then just doing nothing with that information.
It can feel even worse after that, to be honest, when you know that's been the case. And again, it's another form of communication, really. This one being through the form of surveying and like you said, it's all about following that up if you do get those things as well. So when we look forwards to businesses offering support for those who are victims of bullying, what sort of immediate steps should a company take when an employee reports being bullied or struggling with their well-being? If we take it from the legal perspective, for example, with you, Gillian, first.
Yes, well, if it's a question of bullying, or indeed even if they're saying they're struggling with their well-being, I think the first thing to remember is this is a very courageous step for them to talk about it. So that's got to be recognised, and they need to be given as much support and empathy as possible in dealing with it. If it's a question of bullying, there's some very serious legal considerations to be taken into account. For example, this could be potentially gross misconduct, depending on the nature of it. If it's a very serious form of harassment, you might even be looking at potentially suspending that employee straight away. So you'd really need to take advice and make sure that there is a proper investigation carried out. And there is appropriate action taken. And again, I think sometimes businesses can be a bit inconsistent in their approach it, so that if it's maybe a star performer who is guilty of this behaviour, maybe wanting to deal with that informally, whereas other employees, they would deal with it more formally. Consistency is so important in how they deal with these allegations.
Regardless of leaders, star performers or underperformers, everybody needs to be taken into account in the same way.
Yes, I'm a star performer with toxic behaviours is going to mean bad trouble for your business.
And Abbey, what about from an HR perspective for you?
So for our company, and really for any company, there should be a zero tolerance policy on bullying. So what that means is as soon as you hear that or someone approaches you and said that they feel like they've been bullied, you need to deal with it right there and then. Whether that's informally or formally, it kind of depends on the situation and how bad is it. As Gillian said, it could come under misconduct or gross misconduct. So it really depends on the severity, but the most important thing is that it's zero tolerance and that it's nipped in the bud right there, because otherwise it can escalate, it can spread, and it can affect other people as well, and then it gains into that negative culture. So ensuring that it stays as confined as possible, as confidential as possible, and that it's just nipped right there in the bud and resolved.
Because I suppose with these kind of things, a bit like you alluded to there, the whole reason things become toxic is when these things are allowed to seep and they're not nipped in the bud. And it's not to say that they won't occur, because they, when you bring people together and you bring a stressful work environment and everything like that, things can appear. It's always about how you deal with it and how quickly you nip it in the bud to stop it spreading. And of course, like you're saying, analyze it. Perhaps it's nothing. It can be dealt with really quietly and quickly and move on. Otherwise, things can become more serious, of course. But you've acted quickly to assess that. Can you tell me a little bit about the importance of employee assistance programs, especially in terms of supporting employees' mental health and well-being, and how can companies ensure that these programs are accessible and effective? How does it work here with iHasco?
Yeah, I mean, we have our own health plan, and every company is going to be different on what they have. But with our system, it's confidential. It's someone that you can reach out to 24/7. So whether that's counselling or other kind of advice, you can reach out to them. Here at iHasco, alongside that as well, we have mental health first aiders, which are really key. It's just someone who's always in office. We let colleagues know every single day who is in office, who is on Teams, whether that if they're remote as well, because we want to be able to offer support to everyone. And they can just simply reach out to them. And again, that's confidential unless it needs to be escalated in a serious matter. But yeah, and then with these other programs, they're all confidential and they can reach out at any time. And I think it's really important that the colleagues have wellbeing checks and that they are looked after, because at the end of the day, we're at work a lot of the time. It's a big chunk of our life, and life doesn't just stop at work. So it's important that we have that support so that colleagues can continue to come to work, feel safe, and feel listened to, and like their wellbeing is being taken care of.
Brilliant. And just for anyone who doesn't know what a mental health first aider is, can you just give us a little bit of a description and what that process would look like if you did want to reach out to them?
Yeah, so I think we have around 10-ish in our company, and that's someone in pretty much every department. We try and cover every department. Obviously HR, we kind of have a lot of experience with that anyway, but some of us are mental health first trained as well. And what that means is they do go on a program, and then they get their mental health first aider certificate. And what that means is that any colleague can reach out to them at any point, and they are covered on all types of mental health issues. And they can just approach them and say, hey, I need a chat. They'll pull some time aside and they'll have that conversation with them, and make sure they're okay, offer them support. Obviously, you have kind of your external support as well, and different websites and, different things that the NHS provide us as well. But they're really kind of like a first step if they want to reach out to them. And I think it's important that they're there, because if you have a good culture, like I think we do at iHasco, you can reach out to them and they're almost like a friend already. So it's already like just having a conversation, but they're trained, professionally trained, and it's confidential. So
great, that's good to know. And Gillian, from a sort of legal perspective, I guess, especially looking at some of the cases that you've dealt with over the years, again, the same question, sort of how important are employee assistance programs and other mental health resources when it comes to showing maybe that an employer has done everything reasonably to put to try and create a positive working culture or put the resources in place? How important are they?
Well, they are a really key element of that because it's a very clear sign that they are investing in the well-being of employees. But from a practical perspective as well, it's all very well saying to managers, be open to having these conversations and develop that relationship of trust. But when someone does open up, you need to be able to give some practical support to them. And of course, managers are not going to be professionally trained in this. And therefore, if you have an employee assistance program, it's a great solution to help employees access the support they need, especially when you're talking at a time when waiting lists for support generally in the community can be very, very long. And often you'll be dealing with employees in crisis. That's why mental health first aiders, again, very, very useful. It's a great help. But again, they're not professionally trained to offer the support that some employees may need.
Okay, great. So before we wrap up, we have one last question for you both. And I know that we've talked obviously a little bit about how training is important, especially IHASCO training, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What role does training play in equipping managers and employees with the skills to recognize and respond to the signs of bullying or mental health struggles? Gillian?
It's critically important. If you don't carry out regular, effective training, you won't stand any chance of being able to show that you've taken all reasonable steps to prevent bullying from happening. And I think there's really, your managers are the guardians of your culture. And if they're not equipped with the tools that they need to deal with situations, then, you can't possibly hope to have any strategies really embodied in practice in your business.
Abbey?
Basically just echo what Gillian said, really. But, take it from a naive point of view of, let's say no one knows what bullying and harassment is. Having this training is putting it in place and saying black and white, this is what it is, and this is what is acceptable and isn't acceptable. And then therefore, if anyone does anything that's unacceptable, you can then fall back on it from a legal point of view as well and say, nope, we provided you with the training saying that this is acceptable, this isn't acceptable, and it just gives a really clear guideline. I think with colleagues, it's really important that you're very clear with them, very honest with them, and very consistent. And I think giving that training ensures that everyone is consistent, everyone's acting the way that they should, and overall, kind of to summarise and go back to our start point, have that positive culture, which is really, really important.
Fantastic. Great way to wrap it up. So like I said, that concludes this month's episode of The Learning Lounge by IHASCO. We hope that you have a better understanding of when banter goes too far, and you have picked up a few tips for building and maintaining a better company culture. Special thanks to Gillian and Abbey for joining us today. And if you'd like to listen again or share this podcast, you can visit the IHASCO website, YouTube channel, or find us on Spotify, where you'll be able to listen on demand. Abbey, Gillian, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
And we'll see you all next time.